department. And I'm very grateful to him for stepping up and looking into and learning about the history of this McLennan Physical Laboratories, and he's going to tell us about a bit about the history of the department and what it was like when it opened. So please join me in welcoming Stephen.
Yeah, I seem to have become the default department historian. It's really by default because when I see old stuff lying around in the halls, I am compelled to pick it up and put it in my lab. So I have quite a collection of oddments. And I give some stuff to the scientific instrument collection, so you see some of the things that were in the lobby. Some of those things have been scalped from various rooms by me. My talk is really about McLennan, not about McLennan Physical Laboratories, this building. It's not really a history of the department so much as this building. All the people involved in making up this talk are alumni. I'm an alumni in 1991. Eric Weidenhammer, who is sitting over there, who is actually the curator of the University of Toronto Scientific Instrument Collection, from which the instruments in the lobby were drawn, and he was invaluable at finding some of the old stuff that I'm going to show you. And Victoria Fisher, who is an alumna-to-be, is a graduate student. Is she here? She's out doing her job, manning the booth out there. She also helped me get the talk together. And a lot of things I'm going to show you are culled from a couple of dusty cardboard boxes in the archives of the university, so it's kind of fun spelunking in the archives of the university. So our story is about this date, September 14, 1967, just a little less than 50 years ago. This is the golden key being used to open McLennan for the first time. And this is Harry Welsh, and this is Gerhard Hertzberg, and I don't know who the other guys are. They're university functionaries, so I didn't try to find out who they were. But this picture and others like it used to be down in the undergraduate wing, framed down there for like 46 years or something. We just took them down a few years ago. So anyway, we should really go back and pay homage to where our roots were. The old building was built in 1907, and this is actually an artist's watercolor of the building. It's not actually a photograph. It's the artist's rendition of what the building should look like. And I want to point that out to you, because later we're going to see what the artist's renditions of our current building looked like. It opened in 1907, and this is actually from a Physics Today article by Miss Allen, so I should probably credit Miss Allen too, because I culled some stuff from her book. And it was our home for exactly 60 years. And one of the things I want to get across to you is it's going to be about 60 years before we get the next building. So maybe the next building should be in our mind, right? I love this picture because it shows the sort of top-hatted ladies and gentlemen and a horse and all this foliage, which just isn't there, right? So it's kind of interesting. We are fortunate, perhaps, that we moved out of this building in 1967, because 10 years after we moved to McLennan, that building burned to the ground in 1977, after we had given it to the Faculty of Engineering. So, had we still been there, I suppose it would have been our fire instead of their fire. But the interior of the building was all made of timbers and wood, and it was just a shell of fancy stone holding up all this wood, and the whole front end of the building was gutted by the fire. And famously, the engineering students rushed into the other end of the building and pulled out all the large 1-inch tapes that were from the computing center there and rescued all the data by nicking all the tapes out. So I guess our story really begins 10 years before the opening of the building in 1957. So in 1957, a committee was put together by the university to plan for the new West Campus, all the new buildings that were going to be built, and all the expansion that was going to be done. And it featured our own Ron Farquhar. So the committee consisted of Miss Allen, Ron Farquhar, Kelly Gottlieb, Archie Hallett, Ken McNeil, McRae from astronomy, who I don't know, and some secretaries and somebody from the administration. So I believe that Ron is the last man standing of this group. And of course, I should now turn the whole talk over to Ron, who remembers every detail of the deliberation process. But they wrote a couple of reports during the planning process. And the thing I would draw your attention to is their basic instruction was to plan for a 250% enrollment increase in the next 10 years. So that's a pretty tall order. So basically, they were asked to double the floor area of the building and modernize everything. But the new building was to be 2.5 times roughly the floor area of the old building. That was the broad mandate. And in the first report, they came to their main recommendation, which is they recommended a building of not more than 5 floors, including the basement. Okay, so this is going to be the ironic part of our story. So here on page 2 of the 1958 planning report is a thing which I think is hilarious. These are the number of floors. Staff members in physics necessarily are moving back and forth between different parts of the building during the day, i.e. between offices, various research laboratories, workshop, lecture hall, undergraduate laboratories. Elevator service, even at its best, involves annoying delays and could not provide the desired efficiency of movement in a many-storied building. So, well, just hold that thought. I'm going to explain what happened there, okay? And here in the second report of the committee, buried in Appendix 2, way down under Item 2, under Item C, is a fateful line. And remember, astronomy and part of computer science, we're going to move into this building too. It says, astronomy's observation deck, to be on the roof of the physics building, should be as far as possible from the high stacks of the heating plant. Okay, so this is a fateful line, as we'll discover. Okay, so the design process. I expected, when I started this project, to find competing designs. I expected to find architects competing to design the physics building with different concept drawings and all of this stuff. None of that happened, okay? What happened was the university was given a big pile of money by the provincial government to build not just this building, but a dozen buildings. And not only this university, but a half a dozen other universities were being built at the same time. So there was this huge pot of money being put forward to university buildings. And so the way it worked out was a consortium of architecture firms who had experience with this kind of building just made a kind of consortium of companies, and the jobs were just doled out to those companies by the universities. There was no competing bids. There was no competing designs. Everything was just handed out like that. Eventually, the firm of Shore and Moffett were selected to design MP, and that occurred by at least 1959. And they actually had extensive experience building university buildings. They built buildings at Waterloo. They built science buildings at Waterloo. They built a lot of schools. They built a lot of government buildings. And so they were a very large architectural firm. And I would say that they were total, unabashed modernists. Okay, so every building they built looks exactly like this building, more plus or minus. It's very boxy and, in the classic 60s modernist style. So here's a picture of, I should also mention that the One Spadina building, which is just opening in One Spadina Circle, actually has an architecture library which is named after this firm, the Shore and Moffett Library. So it's a very well-established firm. It still exists. And so here's a picture of some of the members of Shore and Moffett. And when the advertisement for this talk went out, we were sort of astonished to discover that one of the original architects was still alive, and he came out of the woodwork and informed us that he would like to, say something about this. So we actually had a wonderful conversation with Bill Greer, and this is what he looks like today. He's 92. And so Victoria Fisher and I interviewed Bill for several hours, and I learned many funny things from Bill Greer. So I will regale you with stories, but really I wish he had been here to tell you. He's a wonderful guy. He built many university buildings around the province, and he can tell lots of funny stories. The reason he's not here with us today is that he's over at his own alumni event, the 70th of his graduation from Trinity College. So there you are. Okay. So Shore and Moffett were selected, and they began the design, but that wasn't the end of the story. There was a little pushback against the idea of moving. And Miss Allen discusses this, but she very diplomatically doesn't mention who it was that was doing the pushback. But there was a suggestion, and it was very carefully documented, that the old McLennan laboratory, which is the one that burnt down in 1977, that it had not yet burnt down at this point, but the idea was to build an extension of 4 floors onto the back of it, and thus double the floor area of the department without moving. And so there was an effort by some faculty members to avoid moving. And that was squashed, basically. We didn't manage that. And I guess that means at that time that the Galbraith building, which now occupies that space, wasn't there yet. Okay, so eventually the engineers got our building and our old building, and Galbraith, the new engineer, well, not new, but a new engineering building was built onto the back of it, and so that's why the back end of the building isn't visible anymore. Okay, so Shore and Moffat went away, and they started making concept drawings. And this is the earliest concept drawing that I know of the proposed building. And you see it's a magnificent example of sort of late 50s stuff. Everything is very stylized. The trees are very stylized. Here's the sort of proto-McLennan Burton Tower. It's in a different place. You're on St. George Street looking west here. And this is chemistry. And this thing, I couldn't figure what this was, but it turns out to be a curling rink. So somewhere, roughly where our north wing is, there used to be a curling rink. And when I showed this picture to Bill Greer, he said, "Oh yeah, the architecture school moved into the curling rink because there wasn't any space." So I think he remembered that they'd added the curling rink to this picture because of their association with the School of Architecture. But I think our undergraduate wing sits on the place where there was a curling rink. And here's a lovely automobile. I'm not sure what it's doing there. But you see, this is it's a 1, 2, 3. It's not as high as it eventually turned out to be. So that's 1959. Eventually, after much discussion, the design emerged, and it is a classic tower in a park. Okay, so if you know your architecture history, this Courvoisier idea of having a kind of parkland with a big vertical tower poking out of it, kind of like 666 Spadina is a classic example of building up here. We ended up with a tower in a park, except we didn't get the park. Okay, so this is the proposed building. And again, we see the very stylized people and trees. And I'm pretty sure there never was a park proposed for this site. It's just a way of kind of citing it in the concept. I think they never intended to put the park there. But anyway, and this is actually from the big, thick history of the university book by whatever his name is. I can't remember. But anyway, it's discussed in the history of the university how this design came about. And it says, "Note the planned green space and the absence of roads and vehicles." Okay, so here's a vehicle actually. All right, so now we see basically the building as it eventually was built, and you're sitting right here at the moment. Okay, and the number of floors in the tower and everything has converged on the number that we have now. So the burning question. So there's a bit more pushback. Okay, after the design was made, there was a report to the dean, and I suspect that this report was the result of complaints. But anyway, in the appendix of this report, there's a number of complaints that were brought. Appended notes on aspects of the proposed building which continue to disturb members of the Department of Physics. The big one is the high 14-story tower has been made a feature of the building against the recommendations of the faculty committee. The tower is not dictated by the limitations of the site. It appears to be inefficient in the use of gross space. It makes for poor circulation of personnel. It gives laboratories which are too small, only 17 feet clear to the wall or window. So they were thinking of labs in the tower. And the other one that was noticed is the department offices are not sufficiently accessible from the main entrance and the other parts of the building. So currently we have the department offices are on the 3rd floor. So when you come in, you have to go through 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 doors and take the elevator 3 floors to reach the receptionist. Okay, so I submit to you that here we are, 1962 or so. The main problems that we fight with the building every day are already well identified. Okay. So why was the Burton Tower built so high? Now, when I was a young lad, a graduate student, Dave May, my supervisor, told me that the university wanted to have a skyscraper, that skyscrapers were in. And he remembered, Dave May remembered being on, in some discussion and sending the university a boxy building as a design and coming back with a 15-story skyscraper. And he believed that it was just the prestige of skyscrapers which had turned the university's feeling. But Bill Greer told me the following story. He said that the tower was designed to satisfy the demands of the astronomer on the committee, that the telescopes would be elevated above the plume of the chimney. And that's indeed what it says in the appendix of that report. And this was the plume of the old steam plant across Russell Street, and also the prestige value of skyscrapers. So he's a kind of engineering-oriented guy. He discussed how this was difficult because they had to stiffen the tower. So the core of the tower here is actually reinforced concrete. There's no steel. It's just concrete and rebar. And it's actually extra rigid to avoid swaying in the wind to make the telescopes stable. And then underneath the tower, beneath our feet here, is a very highly reinforced pad of concrete to prevent the tower from shifting or wobbling around in the wind. And he remembered the engineering they had to go through to make the telescope stable on the roof. And the reason it was 15 stories tall was that the steam plant at the time was a lot lower than it is now. And the irony is that as soon as the building was finished, a few years later they tore down the old steam plant and they built another one, and now the new steam tower is taller than the physics building, okay? So next time you're waiting for an elevator and you're going, why is the Burton Tower so tall? You can tell yourself, it's because the old steam plant chimney was so tall, and now this new steam plant chimney is, higher than the building. And I have on Jason Harlow's authority that the plume from the steam plant does ruin the viewing of the telescopes on the top of the building every so often when the wind is in the right direction, right? So I think this is a lesson, okay? Imagine when you're designing something that 50 years later people might think that design looks crazy, okay, because of something that's changed. Okay, so what I did was I actually recorded my conversation with Bill Greer, and I'll put it on the website where you can get at this later, and if you're patient, you can listen to him describe all of his recollections of the building. So here's the drawing of the sub-basement, the foundations of the building, and here Bill Greer pointed out to me all these reinforced struts and things. These are not normally used in the footing of a skyscraper, even a 15-story one. It's all discussed in great detail here. But this is all to stiffen and to stabilize the tower so the telescopes, which are just undergraduate experimental telescopes, don't wiggle around in the wind. Okay, so now we've reached the Sod Turning ceremony, May 6, 1964. The newspaper, the Globe and Mail, of the following day waggishly included a picture of the 1905 Sod Turning, so you can see the ladies in their long dresses and their funny hats, and the men in their bowlers and all this sort of boaters and so on. And here is the 50 or 60 years later, the Sod Turning ceremony. And here is something that we were not able to find, which we believe to be the architectural model of the building. And we suspect that it still exists somewhere. So the university has some kind of off-site storage place which is full of all sorts of artifacts, and we weren't able to penetrate that. But we may someday be able to dredge up the original architectural model of the building. So there's a few more pictures of the Sod Turning. This is Vaughn. I don't know anything about him, but he is the chairman of property committee, and he's holding a miniature shovel of having turned the sod in a miniature fashion. And here's a couple of pictures of the Sod Turning. And it turns out that the site was just gravel at the time, so they had to put in some sod in order to have sod turning. So this is actual sod. And this picture and the one after it, I think this one were also, the one after this one, these ones were also up in the undergraduate wing for many, many years. You might remember as you walk past. But I can't identify everybody in this picture, but I'm sure you can probably, if you're really quick, you can probably figure out that there's some luminaries here. Are any of you in this picture? Who was at the Sod Turning ceremony? Come on. You were there. Are you there? You're not important enough at the time to be there. Anyway, that's 1964. The building didn't open for 3 years after this. Okay, now what I'd really love to show you now is pictures of the construction of the building. Of course, I talked about the architecture firm, but the actual construction was, of course, given to a general contractor, Anglin and Norcross. The general contract was given to them, and they started construction in 1963, and so I'm not sure why it took so long, but it took several years to construct, and it opened in 1967. There are, as far as I know, no photographs of this building under construction. I wanted to show you a picture of the Burton Tower sort of halfway up, like that famous picture of the Eiffel Tower half constructed. But as far as I know, there are no such pictures. They're not in the archives. If any of you know where those pictures are, or you have those pictures, then please give them to me. But as far as I know, there are no pictures. The same company, the general contractor, Anglin and Norcross, were building other famous Toronto buildings at the time. They were, in fact, the general contractor for the famous City of Toronto City Hall. And it was started and was under construction at the same time as this building by the same general contractor. And here's a picture of City Hall under construction. And the 50th anniversary of the opening of the new City Hall was just a few months ago in February of 2017. So it's 50 years old as well. And they, of course, have pictures of their construction, but we don't. Now, one of the ironies of that is that shortly after this building was finished, and our building was finished just about the same time, that famous long-standing company went bankrupt. And the reason it went bankrupt was they had huge cost overruns as a result of problems with leaking at new City Hall. And there's, in fact, a whole book about the saga of the design and all the problems they had building new City Hall. And those of you with long memories might remember that our building was also notorious, especially the Lunik Lab was notorious for leaking. Same contractor, same problem, okay? Now, I don't know, so fortunately our building was finished by Anglin and Norcross before they went bankrupt, but I don't know what effect their impending financial disaster had on the construction of our building, but I can guess, okay? So if anybody knows any more about that story, that's another one of those untold stories. Anyway, in fact, Anglin and Norcross went bankrupt in September of '67, the very month that this building opened for business. So it was presumably structurally finished a little bit before the bankruptcy.
I submitted a list of complaints about my lavatory to them.
Okay, to Anglin and Norcross.
Yes, and 2 days later they went bankrupt.
So you're the problem. It's like, oh my God, the demands are too much. But I believe the real reason of the bankruptcy had to do with the leaking of the parking lot underneath of Nathan Phillips Square. I may be wrong about that, but that's one of the famous things that went wrong with the building. Now today this is considered to be a kind of retro-futurist icon. It even appeared in an episode of Star Trek, if you really know your Star Trek trivia. Our building, not so iconic, but built by the same company. Okay, so we've arrived at the grand opening in September of '67, and this is Harry Welsh and Würzburg opening it, and there was a ceremony at that occasion, and now I'm going to do something that's going to amaze the hell out of you. I am in possession of original 35 millimeter color slides of the opening of the building in 1967, and I don't even remember how I got them. I think I got them from Alan Griffin's office, but I don't know where he got them from. So anyway, we're going to do a slideshow, a real slideshow, honest to God slideshow. And I'm going to turn the lights down a bit because it's a bit dark. Okay, can you get the light on? There we are. It's a little dark. So here the luminaries are assembling, and there's the mace of the university. And here's caps and gowns. And some of you are presumably sitting in this audience. I don't know. I recognize the stupid metal brown chairs, which we've been trying to get rid of for the last 50 years. We used to use them in the advanced lab until I demanded that they be thrown out. Keep going. They're pretty similar. Okay, so there's someone giving a speech. I don't know who it is. And people milling around. And I suppose that we looked at these with Bill Greer, and he was there, but he couldn't remember who anybody was either. So, do you recognize anyone? No, they're kind of small. Does that ring a bell at all to anyone? That's about the only one that shows a close-up. By the way, there's the vent from the Lunik Lab. We'll come back to that. And this is some kind of academic procession. And here's a bit of building material that's not finished yet. And these are not necessarily in the right order, but anyway, he's giving a speech. And people are listening. You see, the technology is a little limp here. But I did scan all of these, and I'll put them on the webpage too, so you can scrutinize them closely. And this is people milling around. This is taken from up in the lounge upstairs. So these are the opening ceremonies. Breaking up, I guess. Does anyone remember being there? Würzburg is presumably sitting on the dais there. Doesn't that sound bring back memories? The sound of a slide projector moving? Okay, that's it. So.
Why did you do it at night?
I guess I'll just leave lights on.
Return the projector to the old exhibit.
Yeah, I can put it in the museum now. Okay, so as part of the grand opening, there was a kind of extended ceremony. Würzburg gave a talk on the problem of diffuse spectral lines, and Charlie Towns gave a talk. And it's funny because we had an anniversary of the department in 2005, or the year of the laser or something. And we invited Charlie Towns, and Charlie just died a couple of years ago at age 100, those of you who remember. He came to our CAP conference here in 2011 and gave a big talk at age 98 or whatever he was. And there are several other famous people, Dickey and Kassler, who's a laser guy, Chandrasekhar, who's an astronomer. Anyway, they had a series of lectures, and the reason I know that Anglin Norcross is the contractor is written on the back of this pamphlet, and a little Googling allowed me to find it. So the event was accompanied by a big dinner in Hart House, and I know that at least 10 of you were there, because the guest list with the addendum in pencil are all preserved in the archives. And so I should have brought it with me and leafed off through many people who are sitting in the room here were all at that dinner. Those of you who remember that. It was covered in the newspapers. This is the Globe and Mail's coverage, which of course is extensive, and this is the Toronto Star's, which is not extensive. And the first striking thing about the coverage is that I forgot to mention the budget. Did I mention the budget for the building was $6 million. And by the time the building opened here, it was $12 million. So now your son is 50. Interesting. So there's no discussion in the archives about the inflated price, but apparently it doubled sometime between the original price and the final price. But I don't know what $12 million is in today's dollars, but it's not an outrageous amount of money. The other thing I noticed, this shows someone looking at the telescope, and this shows graduate student Ed Beerstone looking at a very primitive CRT display of a computer, and it says student Ed Beerstone, looking at a graphic display unit. Well, Ed Beerstone was later the director of the Fields Institute. It's got to be the same guy. Maybe I'm wrong.
You talked about how much money it was. I just remember the first year of this building, the Canadian dollar was 10% above the American dollar. It was stronger.
Yeah, that doesn't happen very often. So it's 12 million real dollars, I guess. The other funny thing is, if you look closely, there it says something about lasers here, and it says, most people only know the laser as a James Bond weapon, and talks about that. And both papers mention the glass blower. So here's Jack Legg, you might remember. I remember him making a diffusion pump, much like the one that's on display in the lobby. It might even be the same one, for all I know. But he was here when I arrived, so he was a long-standing guy. And his whole glass-blowing operation was set up. And I suppose we must have touted that, because it's mentioned in all of the press afterward, as if glass-blowing was important somehow to the building. So this is the finished overhead view. This was actually taken from an airplane, and you see it's all shiny and spanking new. And there's those stupid little benches out in the plaza there. And the other thing I'd draw your attention to is this lovely thing down here. And this is what earth science used to look like. And I wonder if I think that might be one of the chimneys we were trying to avoid. But I think the steam plant is over here. That's actually been there for longer than the building has. So it's probable that the steam plant would have been the old steam plant in this picture. We also hosted, back in the day, we used to host the CAP regularly, CAP Congress. And so, in fact, the first year after the building was opened, we hosted the CAP Congress in 1968. And for the whole year of that year, the physics building, that same picture, was on the cover of Physics in Canada. So the building featured some amazing things, and I'm looking at it, I'm still amazed. One of the most amazing things was the Lunik Lab, which I'll come back to. It actually opened a year before the building did, in 1966. The whole building, all the labs of the building were wired for DC. And if you look in the archives, there's actually a lot of discussion about how to design and how much ripple are we going to tolerate and what voltages do we want and all this stuff on the DC supply. But nowhere does it say, why did they want the DC supply? Does anyone know? I mean, it's kind of useful. What I was told was it was to drive the filaments of tube devices, but maybe I'm wrong about that. Well, there was a special magnet supply separate from the DC supply. Yes. That's a separate thing that's discussed in detail. Each research group, including the big magnet group, basically made a wish list, and their laboratories were all designed in detail. Yeah.
We pushed for DC supply.
Yeah. Why do you remember? I guess it's because the old building probably had it, and so it was a kind of legacy thing. I talked to Bill Greer about the air conditioning. I said, one of our complaints is that every 6 months we go from heating to cooling, and there's 2 weeks of misery when it's too hot or too cold. And he said, well, air conditioning was not normal in buildings at that time. Most of the buildings that he had designed as part of his architectural work did not have air conditioning. They were schools and government buildings and even lots of university buildings. They had no air conditioning. So the fact that we had air conditioning at all is actually a kind of relatively new thing. Many people have told me that when they moved into the building, there was no good furniture, and they had to go back to the old building and steal furniture. Does anyone remember doing that? And apparently, Gordon West told me that they went over to the dump over here where the university throws all its furniture out and nicked all the furniture back again and brought it back to the building. And I believe that quite a bit of that furniture is still in the building. I'm not making this up. There's World War II surplus-looking furniture all over the building, the old gray metal desks. I don't believe those were bought when we moved into the building. They were just nicked from somewhere and brought over here. And I mentioned before the little brown metal chairs. We used those for decades in the advanced lab until we replaced them just a few years ago. And Gordon also told me a funny story that when he moved into the tower, he discovered that the offices had not yet been wired or were not going to be wired for telephones. So there was a single telephone in a little box on the floor, like a phone box, and a buzzer system had been set up to alert people that they had a phone call. Does anyone remember this? Come on, you're supposed to be heckling me with funny stories here. Anyway, those are the funny stories that I heard about the features of the building. But one of the sort of most mysterious things, to me anyway, is the Lunik Lab, because I've spent time prowling, as I do, in the sub-basement of this building, and I just find it an astounding space. And right now, it's just like a museum of junk, But I had never seen a picture of the Lunik. I had no idea how it was laid out. I don't know anything about it. So it was interesting to me to pull up the stuff about the Lunik Lab. This is a drawing partly by the Shore and Moffat, but partly annotated by somebody, possibly Ken McNeil, that shows the layout of the sub-basement in the Lunik Lab. You come down the elevator or down the stairs over here, and you go through the security doors, and then you go down this long corridor, and then there's this big room at the end, and then there's this warren of strange rooms with funny shapes and so on. But here's actually the location of the accelerator, where they call it stage 2, and here's the control room, and here's where Isotrace was until recently. The machine was built by a company called Vickers and Armstrong, and it only operated between the opening of the building in 1978, when I heard from somebody that it had been sold to somebody in Melbourne, Australia. Eventually, it was replaced by Isotrace, the Isotrace machine, and ironically, the Isotrace machine was moved to the University of Ottawa, and the last pieces of the old Isotrace machine have just been taken out a few weeks ago, and we were down there taking pictures of all this stuff. Another little funny thing is, here is future isotope production cyclotron. If only we had done it, It never was built there. We could have made a fortune. We could have been contenders, But no, there was no isotope production cyclotron built there. So here are the first pictures I've ever seen of the Lunik machine, looking spanking new, with gentlemen with ties on operating it. And this is in the machine room itself, 2 pictures. And here's part of the control room. And here's somebody, I don't know who. Is it one of you? Who is it? You don't know. If Ted doesn't know, then we don't know. It looks like he's smoking, but I believe it's a pen. But he's adjusting all the beautiful analog controls of the Lunik Lab. And here's a slightly different drawing which shows a slightly different version of it with different things labeled differently. But I would like to point out that this room here, the former control room of the Lunik, is now the future home of the University of Toronto Scientific Instrument Collection. So it's very appropriate. Whatever's left of the control panel is still there. I don't know how much is actually left. But for how many decades the university has been not giving the Scientific Instrument Collection a permanent home. And finally, after all this time, we're going to have a permanent home. And I hope that in September or whenever you guys move in, we'll have another event down in the sub-basement, and you'll get to see the beautiful new Scientific Instrument Collection space down there. And so it's going to go in that room there, which is suitably far enough from the walls that the leak problem is not too bad. You can see where the architects had a little fun. They didn't just stick to their modernist, minimalist roots. They actually got into kind of sculptural things. They designed the air intake for the Lunik in this beautiful sort of swoopy design, and you can tell they're having fun with this, okay? And Bill Greer remembered the design of this intake. And this is what it looks like today. It's surrounded by forest now. And it's still used, I think, as an air intake, but I guess there's not as much power being dissipated down there, so we don't need as much air to go down there. But anyway, some years later, we built a garden there, so I'll talk about the garden in a few minutes. Another piece of the history which I find quite interesting is the idea that there was actually a pneumatic tube system installed in the building to carry samples, radioactive samples from the target area of the LINAC using one of these sliding sample holders and all the way through the sub-basement and up into room 056. So I remember in the back of 056, which is, I remember it because it's almost the only room in the basement that actually has a fume hood, there used to be a big block of concrete with holes in it for storing radioactive samples, and those samples could be delivered from the LINAC, from the target of the LINAC, by pneumatic tube. And you can still, if you walk around down in the sub-basement and look closely, you can still see some pipes which have suspiciously slow, large radii of turning, and those are part of the sample movement system. And this was obviously designed by Larson or Lamson Conveyors. It's obviously a company that makes pneumatic systems. Do you know anything about this? No? Okay. So we had tubes. Okay. So where are we today? So if you look at the building today, this was actually taken at Science Rendezvous just a few weeks ago. From this point of view, nothing has changed, okay? It looks a little dirtier, but it looks exactly like it did on opening day, 1967. But if you turn your head 90 degrees, you see that it looks quite different. I was involved when chemistry got its large renovation from the Davenport family. The children of the Davenport family actually were prevailed upon to donate several $1 million to renovate the plaza between physics and chemistry. And so now what used to be a bare plaza with a down steps and an up steps has now been completely leveled off, and all those trees and all this foliage has been planted there. The other side of the building still looks like it did in 1967, but this side is all greenified. And I wanted to point out that we still are struggling with renovation in the building. Jason Harlow and all of his successors have been struggling to renovate the undergraduate laboratories. And so just hopefully in September, I guess, a new thing will open in the first floor of the north wing on the west side called the Physics Cafe. And you see it actually has rounded corners and things, and there are rooms for students to work together. It's called the Physics Cafe, and the technicians' rooms will be moved to here. And this is what it looks like now. It's a disaster area at the moment. Jason just took this picture a couple of days ago, so this is what it looks like. It's not ready for opening yet. But it's in conjunction with the final 2 practical teaching rooms that we built. We have 3 practical rooms wrapped around the old first-year labs, and they are complete rethinking of how we teach first-year physics laboratories and tutorials. They have special hexagonal tables, and they're all informed by educational research about what the best way to teach is. And now, when these 2 rooms are finished and the Physics Cafe opens, we'll complete the renovation of the first floor of the undergraduate wing. And this is what the practical rooms look like now. It's a complete rethinking of how we teach labs, and it's very computer-friendly and computer-oriented. These are all the happy students learning in the new space. So the building it's not incapable of improvement. We have improved some of it, but this is where we are today. Happy 50th birthday, McLennan. Thank you very much.
Say that a year and a half ago when I said at a faculty meeting that the 50th anniversary of the opening of the building was coming up, what should we do? Stephen Morris immediately said, blow it up.
I said to have a jackhammer party is what I said. I didn't want to blow it up. I wanted to personally destroy it.